Hello everybody, this is TipTop MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the mechanics of Innistrad Midnight Hunt. There are actually a ton of mechanics in this set, and they do a wide variety of things, so we're going to take a look at them one at a time. I'm going to explain them a little bit, and we can just kind of talk about them. Starting off, we have Transform. So Transform is a mechanic that allows you to take a card and flip it over, and you essentially end up with another card. Let's take a look at Enduring Angel. It's 2 white for a creature angel 3/3 with flying, double strike, and gives you hexproof. Then it says, if your life total would be reduced to 0 or less, instead transform Enduring Angel and your life total becomes 3. The rest of the card really doesn't matter for the purposes of this demonstration, but essentially you would flip the card over and now the card is Angelic Enforcer. Transform is used on a couple of cards and the cards will just tell you to transform them, but there are also 2 other mechanics in the set that deal with transforming permanents. So just know, transform means flip it over. This is a returning mechanic from lots of previous sets. So, next we have a mechanic all around transforming. So, Tavern Ruffian is a 3 and a red for a creature human warrior werewolf, and he has the mechanic daybound, and his backside, she has the mechanic daybound, and the backside is Knightbound. So essentially, daybound says, if a player casts no spells during their own turn, it becomes night next turn. And Knightbound said, if a player casts at least 2 spells during their own turn, it becomes day next turn. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at some tokens. Day and night. These aren't actually tokens, but they're indicators, similar to the City's Blessing in Ixalan. So essentially, whenever a permanent with daybound enters the battlefield, it becomes day. And it says, as it becomes day, transform all nightbound permanents. And then, if a player casts no spells during their own turn, it becomes night next turn. So essentially, if a player decides that on their own turn they don't want to cast any spells, it becomes night. Now, this is not something you have to track in every game. It's only tracked once the first the first daybound permanent is played. So when you play a daybound permanent, you then have to track it for the rest of the game. Or there are going to be some cards that say if it is neither day nor night, it becomes day. So there will be some cards that do not have daybound on them that can make it day. But essentially, the game will start off with it being day. Then when someone decides to cast no spells, the next turn you flip it to night. And it says, as it becomes night, transform all daybound permanents. So going back to this card over here, it would go from the 2/5 to the 6/5 once it flips over to night. Then it says permanents enter the battlefield nightbound, which essentially means that if it was night and then you played Tavern Ruffian, instead of it entering the battlefield as Tavern Ruffian, as for instance in older Innistrad sets when the abilities were actually on the card, it would enter as Tavern Ruffian and you'd have some werewolf, some not. So this way, it would enter the battlefield transformed automatically. And then if a player casts at least 2 spells during their own turn, it becomes day next turn. So if someone manages to cast 2 spells on their own turn, it becomes day. So you get day and night, flip back and forth, switches all your werewolves. It actually is going to be a little bit easier to track than previous werewolf mechanics, where in the past you had to essentially say, oh, this one's flipped, this one's not, now they're all flipped, now they're not. It could lead to some confusion. With this one, if it is night, all of your permanents will be nightbound, whether they were on the battlefield when it became night or whether you played them afterwards. And again, that is a transform mechanic. The next mechanic we have is Disturb. It's 1 in a blue for this card specifically for Baithook Angler, and it has an ability for Disturb and then a mana cost. So Disturb 1 in a blue, you may cast this card from your graveyard transformed for its Disturb cost. So essentially, once this thing dies or gets milled into your graveyard or somehow ends up in there, you can pay 2 mana and replay it from the graveyard, but it comes back as its backside. And so far, every Disturb card has the text, if this card would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead, so that you can't just keep replaying it. So we have Transform that some cards just let you do. We have Transformed based on day or night, and then we have Transformed from the graveyard. So we kind of have some really interesting takes here. Just note, these are not going to be like modal double-face cards. You cannot just choose to play Hook, Haunt, Drifter. I do think it's going to be a little bit confusing to have so many double-face cards in Standard at the same time, but just know, they do not function like the cards from Strixhaven, Kaldheim, and Zendikar Rising. You have to play the front side, and then some condition gets you to the back side. Either way, Disturb will be seen mostly on spirits, and it's another interesting way that things can transform. All right, next we have Coven. So Coven's not actually technically a mechanic, it is an ability word, meaning that it's signifying to you that, hey, this cares about a certain characteristic. An example of this would be Landfall from Zendikar Rising. Landfall literally just says at the beginning of your, whenever land enters the battlefield under your control. And it actually just says landfall. And it's actually more words to do that. But what it does is it signifies in your mind, hey, this cares about this theme. So what Coven cares about is that you control 3 or more creatures with different powers. So essentially, let's take a look at Candlechap. This thing will basically give something defender and make it so it doesn't deal damage. And then Coven, pay 2 and a white and sacrifice it, exile enchanted creature, activate only if you control 3 or more creatures with different power. So you'll notice this is an ability you can only use once you have creatures with 3 or more different powers. Then we have Candlelit Cavalry, which also has Coven, but it says at the beginning of your combat on your turn, if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, it gains trample until end of turn. So again, it is the same theme of wanting those 3 different creatures, but it's being used in a different way. So Coven can be, triggered abilities, activated abilities. It just is going to be on cards and cares about creatures with different powers. All right. Next, we have Investigate. This is a returning mechanic similar to Transform, which essentially just says create a clue token, and a clue token is an artifact with pay 2 mana, sacrifice this artifact to draw a card. So essentially, it's like a treasure for cards that does require a little bit of mana for activation. Investigate can be really, really powerful for a couple reasons. First off, it allows them to kind of add draw. I don't want to say half a card, but you can essentially pay later to turn your spells into cantrips. But also why it's more powerful is that it actually creates an artifact. So this is 1 in a blue to create an artifact. And then if you flashback this, which we'll talk about flashback in a second, you get to create 2 artifacts. And so that's where a lot of the power comes from. But even if you end up just paying a blue and then paying 2 mana, you are drawing a card for 3 mana, which is not a great rate. But it's one of those things where you can abuse it because it's an artifact, and then you can maybe flashback it later and get some extra cards there as well. So just Investigate is a really interesting mechanic in my opinion. Next, and just this will appear on random cards throughout the set. You probably won't build an Investigate deck, but if you do decide to build an artifact deck, Investigate could totally go in it. Either way, next we have Decayed. So let's read Jadar, Ghoulcaller of Nephalia. 1 in a black for a legendary creature, human wizard, 1/1. At the beginning of your end step, if you control no creatures with Decayed, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. And Decayed is an ability that says it can't block. When it attacks, sacrifice it at end of combat. So it can't block for you, and when you decide to attack it, you only get 1 attack out of it. So essentially what you're going to want to do is maybe attack with it, maybe get some damage in it, and then sacrifice it before it can sacrifice itself to get some sort of effect. So it's going to be creatures... It's going to be good in decks that want creatures to die or that are looking for death triggers, stuff like that. It's going to be pretty awesome, but it allows you to create tokens for cheaper. So for instance, this is on a 2 mana permanent, giving you a 2/2 every turn that you can swing with. But because you can't keep them, it is a little bit more balanced. We're not going to talk about Will Helt, but I just wanted to show that it's also going to be cared about in the commander decks for Innistrad. Next, we have Flashback, which we talked about a little bit, but essentially Flashback lets you pay a mana cost and cast the spell from the graveyard. So Join the Dance lets you pay 5 mana to cast this card from its graveyard, and then you'll exile it, so you can't just keep casting it. So you'll create 2 1/1s for 2 mana, and you can then cast it later on in the game for 5 mana. It often helps with board states that get stalled, because it lets you kind of do stuff even if you are still top decking lands. Overall, it's a pretty nice ability, and can be nice in those decks where you're milling yourself, because if you mill just a land into the graveyard, it's probably not doing much. But if you mill one of these, it's almost like drawing the card. So kind of cool. So those are the mechanics. Let's quickly run back through them, and you can just see how many of them we have. So going in backwards order, we had Flashback, Decayed, Investigate, Coven, Disturb, Daybound, and Knightbound, as well as Transform. This is the most mechanics I've ever seen in a Magic set. I mean, we saw a lot with like Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, but these are all very different mechanics that all kind of work weirdly, and it's not like they're super duper split up. So I wonder if this is going to be a direction we see Magic move more towards in the future, of just lots of different mechanics. It definitely seems a little bit confusing. However, I think the big reason for this is that we're going to see very similar mechanics in the next set. I would bet daybound, nightbound could even stay as a mechanic, and you see like werewolves and bats or whatever. I'd almost guarantee transform cards are going to stay for it. Maybe we don't see disturb. You know, I would expect maybe one or two of these mechanics to switch out for other ones, but I would expect things like investigate and flashback to stay consistent across both sets, as well as stuff like maybe even Coven. But then again, it does have a focus on the vampire wedding stuff, so maybe it'll focus a little bit less on some of those themes, and we'll be able to have new mechanics as well. But I would expect at least a couple of the mechanics to be consistent throughout the two sets. Either way, guys, I wanted to end this video off by saying I'm sorry for being kind of absent from YouTube for about a week now. My life's just got a little bit crazy. I'm glad I was finally able to make this video just to explain some of the mechanics. Spoilers, I'm going to do a little bit differently. I'm just going to cover them every so often, talking about the cards that I think are interesting. If I get a little bit more time, I may talk about some of those other cards as well, but expect a spoiler video either later today or tomorrow. I will see you in the next one. Bye.